The Ottoman Empire was the largest and the last of the Islamic empires. At its peak, it stretched from North Africa to the Arabian Peninsula, the Caucasus, and the Balkans, all the way to the gates of Vienna. It was by far the largest empire of its time, and it was ahead of its competition in terms of science, production, military, and culture. The Ottoman society was unique in its form, and nothing similar has ever been seen in history again. The closest resemblance would be the United States. The Ottomans were a multicultural society, and they didn't decline because of some clash of civilizations. Terms such as these are popular, but not necessarily accurate. After all, a major part of the Ottoman army was made up of Christians and Jews, the other half being Muslims. It was in every sense a multicultural army, with a central authority. The Ottoman Empire didn't go down in flames fighting, and there was no single major catastrophic event that triggered the ultimate decline. But a great civilization is not conquered from without until it has destroyed itself from within. Those were the words of the American historian Will Durant. Before the Turkish Empire collapsed from the outside, it was already for centuries collapsing from the inside. Most people will tell you that two military defeats led to the decline of the Ottomans. One was the Battle of Lepanto in 1571, the other being the Battle of Vienna in 1683. In the Lepanto naval engagement, the vast majority of the Ottoman fleet was destroyed. But within a year, the Ottomans replaced their entire fleet with more modern ships and an even bigger fleet. However, the Ottomans had lost their most experienced sailors and commanders in the battle, and this reduced the effectiveness of the Ottoman navy. The other major defeat came in 1683 at the Battle of Vienna. This wasn't the first time the Turks had tried to take Vienna. In 1529, the Turkish Sultan Süleyman the Magnificent began the siege too late in the season and decided to withdraw. He figured that he returned to conquer Vienna the next year. But there was never a next time. Süleyman got distracted with other affairs. Now, conquering Vienna was part of the national interest of the Ottoman Empire, because Vienna was the limit of Ottoman logistical capability, and conquering the city would have allowed them a fresh new logistical point. It was sort of like conquering a new Cairo or Istanbul. These kind of major cities provided a new logistical point and allowed further expansions. But the Ottomans didn't prioritize their objectives well enough, as they were continuously distracted with other affairs. At the time, the Ottomans were certain they would eventually take the city because they had the strongest army in the world, so they weren't in a hurry. By 1683, the Ottomans figured it was time, and they tried to take Vienna again. But this time, the battle was a defeat, and the Ottoman army was routed. The Turks had missed their opportunity. That is how most people see it, and these defeats certainly played a role, but they weren't the decisive factors that eventually led to the decline of the empire. The process that turned the mighty Ottoman Empire into the sick man of Europe was very gradual and so slow that during the time nobody noticed it. It starts with Venetian traders who in the 15th century went back and forth buying Ottoman raw materials like metal, timber, oil, meat, etc. This was a very lucrative business, and by the 17th century it wasn't just Venetians, but also French, English, German, Dutch and other European traders. They traveled into the Ottoman Empire, buying raw materials with the gold of the Americas, so the European traders could always outbid the Turkish traders. And the Ottoman economy was very complex. It was some kind of state-controlled mercantilism, in which there were guilds who produced certain products. But the products, the amount of the products, and even the price of the products was determined by the state. This was basically done to avoid inflation. After several decades, the Turkish guilds were losing their productivity because there was less material to produce the products, as the European traders were buying up most of the raw materials. The Ottoman Empire needed to protect the domestic production of the empire, and since the European traders were buying up all the raw materials which the Turkish guilds needed, the answer seemed logical: ban Europeans from buying strategic raw materials. And what do people do when their lucrative businesses are banned? They form a black market, where prices are even more expensive but profits even more lucrative. A whole class of black market entrepreneurs emerged. And what does lucrative underground business produce for a society? Corruption. Because the black market entrepreneurs had to bribe officials to look the other way. Over time, this spawned another class of entrepreneurs, bribe-taking bureaucrats. Because of the Ottomans' inability to produce goods, this new rich class could only spend their money on European products, and this provided a new market for the Europeans. The Ottomans bought the European luxury products, and at the time it seemed like the Ottomans were blossoming with wealth. But in fact it was the European traders who were making all the money, because it was the Venetian, the Spanish and the Dutch who sold their luxury consumer products to the Ottomans. The Turks were no longer producing, instead they were consuming. In the meantime, there were so many high-value products that inflation rose. This became another burden on the economy. The same thing happened to the Spanish Empire. Inflation hurts people with a fixed income. The only people with a fixed income in the Ottoman Empire were the bureaucrats and court officials. This bloated, unproductive upper class supplemented their income by taking even more bribes, and thereby corrupted the administrative and legal workings of the state. The court officials prevented economic opportunities instead of facilitating it, unless they were giving a bribe. And this led to the inefficiency of the Ottoman administration. In order to counter the corruption in the court, the state raised the salaries. But since there was no real revenue in the Ottoman economy, the state was merely minting money out of thin air. This in return escalated inflation even further, and puts us back where we started. In the end, the rulers' attempt to stamp out corruption and promote efficiency only aggravated the problem. All the while this was happening, another process took shape: the Janissaries' gradual change towards aristocracy. Now these were Christian children raised with the best education, and they became the elite fighting force of the Ottoman Empire. But the Janissary creed didn't allow them to marry or have children, and they weren't allowed to hold official positions either. This was actually one of the successes of the early Ottoman Empire, because it was a concept of recruitment that allowed new blood to enter the administration, as opposed to aristocracy. And when the Europeans started to switch to plutocracy, the Turks switched to aristocracy. Successful Janissaries married and became high-ranking advisors, and as in any aristocracy, the future leadership and commanders were recruited from the noble families. It no longer depended on the skill and potential of a person. As a result, the Ottoman leadership became more and more narrow-minded, and this added to the decline of science and technology. In the course of a few centuries, the Turks had changed from an efficient, productive people into a society of corrupt bureaucrats and black market entrepreneurs who were draining down the domestic production and the efficiency of the Ottoman Empire. This complex web of corruption established itself over the centuries, and by the time the Turks knew what was going on, they became the sick man of Europe. This was a Caspian report by me, Shirvan. Thank you for watching. Sağ ol.